Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 223 of the Book Cougars, two middle-aged women on the hunt for a good read. I'm Emily.
And I'm Chris. And we wanted to start today with a poem. We lost one of the great poets of our time, Nikki Giovanni, who is also an essayist, an activist, passed away recently. And this poem is called Allowables. I killed a spider, not a murderous brown recluse, not even a black widow. And if the truth were told, this was only a small, sort of papery spider, who should have run when I picked up the book, but she didn't. And she scared me, and I smashed her. I don't think I'm allowed to kill something because I'm frightened.
Man.
Yeah, good poem.
Wow. She packs a punch with so few words. Wow. Thank you for that. Well, in the spirit of thank yous, we have a thank you to a new patron.
Yes. Rochelle, thank you so much for joining our community. We totally appreciate your support.
We're so happy to have you.
Well, Emily, what are you currently reading?
I am reading a book that's been haunting me recently. It's been on a lot of the awards lists. The New York Times just named it one of the top 10 books of the year, which pushed me over the edge to pick it up. At one of our Patreon reading salons, two of our listeners had a little conversation about it. One had read it already, and the other was midway through and was like, oh, should I keep going? And the one who'd read it cheerleaded her on. So all of this made me finally pick up All Fours by Miranda July. I also queried our buddies Russell and Ryan via text because they have very dissimilar reading tastes. And I saw that both of them read it, and one of them gave it 5 stars and one of them gave it 2. So I did a lot of pre-querying before picking this up, which is unusual for me. All to be said that I'm about halfway through. I am currently just reading the hardcover. I do intend to tap into the audiobook because the author, Miranda July, actually reads it, which I feel like the authors do more of reading of nonfiction with their books than you see them reading fiction. Do you feel that way?
I kind of feel that way too. Yeah. I think that's an accurate statement.
Yeah, but she's also a filmmaker and artist in other ways, so maybe reading the audio was something that she wanted to tackle as well. What is it about? It is about a 40-something-year-old woman that's a mother of a young child. She's in the artist world, and she's been paid $20,000 for one line of something she wrote that was used in advertising. And she and her husband decide that it would be good for her to use that money kind of for fun. And so she plans a trip to New York City. She makes a reservation for a fancy hotel, and she decides to do a drive from California to New York. She embarks on this venture and makes it half an hour from home and ends up checking into a hotel room there. And the story goes on from there. I'm not going to say much more about it except to say I understand why this novel isn't for everyone. It's very odd. She pushes the boundaries of sex and what you feel comfortable about, maybe of reading in that realm and experiencing. I'm not going to say that I'm loving it. I'm going to say that I'm like the Robin. It was 2 Robins on the read-along conversation that were talking about this. I'm of the Robin that was saying, should I keep reading this at this point? And so I'm hearing the other Robin in my ear saying, yes, keep reading it. Thank you, Robins. It's an odd story. And it's getting so much praise, which I think is really interesting. And maybe it's because she's pushing boundaries. And that's what's appealing. All Fours by Miranda July. I should say it's blurbed by George Saunders, who also does push boundaries in writing. And his blurb is, a giddy, bold, mind-blowing tour de force.
Well, my current read is an oldie but a goodie. I am finally into The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte. I feel like I've been talking about reading this one all summer, and it's already fall and almost winter. So here I am finally really enjoying it. I'm doing like a bit of a hybrid read between the paper book and my e-reader. I got the free e-copy from Project Gutenberg, and then I have the Penguin Classic. I'm enjoying it very much. So it's about this widow who comes to town and rents Wildfell Hall, which is an old, dilapidated hall, gothic-y looking. You would think it would be haunted. And she's a widow with a young boy who is very different than the locals. She's a painter, and that's how she's supporting herself, but she can't reveal the location of where she is, and we don't know yet why. Mm. But it's really funny, and it seems very contemporary in a lot of ways, the humor and the hypocrisy. It's not like a jaunty kind of hypocrisy. It's more subtle than that, but really very contemporary feeling for something that came from the 19th century.
Amazing.
Yeah, enjoying it very much.
I'm reading Master Slave, Husband, Wife by Ilian Wu. This was one of my hopefuls for Nonfiction November. Here we are in December, but I got to it nonetheless. I had picked up the paper copy out of a little free library and knew that it was one that I wanted to read. It won a Pulitzer this year, and it's just an intriguing story. I also am listening to it. The narrators are Leon Nixon and Janine Edwards, and they're doing a fantastic job with the narration. And this is a true story of a couple that were enslaved, and they escaped slavery in 1848. Ellen and William Kraft are a married couple, as I said, and Ellen dressed as a wealthy white man that was disabled, and then her husband acted as her slave. And that's how they escaped to freedom. So far, they're on different forms of transport to get away. And to me, it's suspenseful because you don't know what's going to happen and you're worried about them. And it's a bit of an adventure story. I'm really enjoying it. I would like to pick up the book because it also has a map. And, I've looked at it, but I haven't gone back to it once I started the audiobook. So that'll be my next step. I'm really enjoying it. Master, Slave, Husband, Wife.
Cool. I look forward to hearing more about that one.
Chris, what did you just read?
Well, I had a surprise read. I needed something different to really drop myself into. And so I picked up The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. And it is a bit of a chunkster of a book, and I whipped through it in 2 days. I love this book so much. So it's about a family in the Adirondacks, a very wealthy family who have their summer estate there. They are still living in Albany. They're a banking family. They are very well connected with all the Manhattan wealthy families. And then there's a caretaking family. They go back generations to the white families that first settled this land. One was the wealthy man who bought the land and had this huge home dismantled in Europe and brought over and recreated in the Adirondacks there on a hill by a lake. And then the caretaker man was a guide in the area who knew everything very well, and he was the one who located the land originally and has been a caretaker ever since. So now it's the third generation there, and the primary caretaker now is a woman who is a really great character. It's one of the things that I enjoyed about this book the most was very distinctly drawn characters that were very different. And it's a situation where you like some of them almost all the time and some of them never, but there's a little bit of crossover in how you feel about these characters. So it's a book about a lot of class issues you can imagine with a setup like that. So this is a book that goes back to when the son of the family, Bear is his name, he's 8 at the time that he goes missing. And fast forward now, is it 12 years later maybe? And they have also established a camp on the grounds that the caretakers, they take care of the land, they also take care of this camp. They run this camp for primarily wealthy children. There's cabins for girls, cabins for boys. I think the youngest campy is like 8, and the older ones are like 12, 13. And then they have, assistant counselors who are like the 17-year-olds. This is a quote I wanted to share about the 12, 13-year-old girls. The boys don't get a ton of attention because the girls are some of the main characters. And this is a quote. "There was a particular brand of humor employed by 12 and 13-year-old girls, especially when they weren't in the presence of boys. It was at once disgusting and innocent, bawdy and naive. when it wasn't being used for ill, when no one was its target. This type of humor delighted Louise. I just love that quote. I mean, some of the scenes took me back to like when I was a Girl Scout and we'd have our week of camping or whatever. Just that feeling of all the girls together. And yeah, kind of a bit raunchy sometimes, actually. And being naive, though, at the same time. It's such a interesting balance.
Right. It's like age-appropriate raunch, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and you think you know so much more when you're that
Right.
age. So Bear disappeared many moons ago, and now his sister wants to attend camp, primarily to escape this annual end-of-the-year fest of a week that the wealthy family throws. She just wants to avoid it. So she's allowed to go to camp. And wouldn't you know, she goes missing.
Oh, my.
Right? So the story is told through all of these different characters, and it jumps around through time. It goes back to the 50s with the girl who disappears, her mother. It goes back to her in time when she's like 17, 18, and just meeting the family that she's going to marry into, up until the 70s, which is when the daughter disappears. There's a woman who's a police officer who's promoted to investigator, the first woman investigator. So there's the mystery, there's crime, there's, of course, hormones and sex happening. I just can't describe this book, really, and I don't feel like I'm doing it justice, but it has class issues, it has feminist issues, mystery, crime, history, the great outdoors. I mean, it is a book that has everything, and it never once got bogged down for me, no matter what was happening. I really appreciated the class issues and the way those were drawn, and I didn't want to leave the characters. I was like, it's one of those books I was bummed when it was over, but so happy to have read it.
Those are the best. We're always searching for those as readers, right?
And I could thank Kate. She gave me her copy when she finished it this summer.
And it originally came onto our radar because Michael Kindness recommended it on our 200th episode. And when he did, it seemed so far away until it was coming out. But here it is.
I know. And that was one I thought that there's two other books I want to make sure I read by the end of the year. And so there's a total of 3. And that was one of them. And I'm so happy I got to it because I remember Michael praising it so hard. And when Michael endorses a book that passionately, I know it's one I want to read.
Yeah.
So again, that was The God of the Woods by Liz Moore, and I am seeing it on a lot of best of lists.
Yes. Hey, little diversion here, but did you see that Yulin Kwang's book is making it on a lot of best ofs this year?
Yeah.
I'm so excited.
How to End a Love Story. That was one of our buddy reads that we did, and we had Yulin on as the author guest.
Yeah, really great. I'm so glad. And it was her debut, so I'm so glad she's getting some notice for that. Liz Moore is also the author of Long Bright River, which was a fan top favorite in one of our top 10 years. I don't know if it was last year or the year before, probably the year before if she just came out with God in the Woods. She's such a great writer. And I just read Long Bright River this year, and it might hit my top 10 for this year.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay,
yeah.
That's good to know. I looked at Emily Funny just now because when she said Long Bright River, I was thinking of the Frozen River.
Oh, right.
That's one of the other books that I hope to get read this year that people have enjoyed so much.
Yeah. Lots of good books out there. So I finished a book that I need to thank our listener Barb for sending us an email about that was not on my radar at all. It's called Into the Uncut Grass by Trevor Noah. When she sent the email, I immediately went to our library systems to try to get a copy, and there were no copies on the shelves except for up at the Noah Webster Library in West Hartford, which is the local library for the Gentleman Caller. And the reason that it was available is I think it was miscatalogued as an adult graphic novel. It's really not an adult graphic novel. So thank you to miscataloguing. I was able to get my hands on this one copy available in the library systems around us. This is a really sweet book. There are some illustrations. They're watercolor illustrations by Sabina Hahn that are quite gentle and lovely. I'm showing some to Chris. And the story is about a young boy and his stuffed teddy bear, Walter. Now, some of you might remember that Trevor Noah wrote a memoir called Born a Crime, which we read as a companion read to Bianca Murray's Hum If You Don't Know the Words. She recommended that we read it when we wanted to read something about South Africa. This is very different. This is a little work of fiction that he wrote. It's a small book. It's not like a kid's picture book. It's for older kids. And it's a fable, and it's about this kid that wants to get outside of his home because he's sure that there are bigger and brighter and more fun things to do. And as he goes on adventures and meets things like garden gnomes and coins, he learns that maybe home isn't such a bad place after all. And there's a really sweet intro by Trevor Noah where he talks about that he butted heads with his mom a lot, and that the little boy in this story represents that. The first couple sentences in the intro say, "This book was inspired by a conflict, specifically the never-ending war between me and my mother. When I was young, my mother and I used to spend a lot of time in a state of debate. As much as I wanted to respect her wishes, I always had my own plans in my tiny little head. Her wishes and my plans were rarely the same." And his grandmother referred to him as a springbok, which is an animal in South Africa. I'm showing Chris a picture. That kind of looks like what I would call an antelope. It's fleet of foot and can run. And she said, because you always wanted to open the door and run. So it was a really sweet. I read it in one sitting. I would say it's a great book to read with a child anywhere over the age of 3, probably. And you could sit down and read it together and then talk about what the teddy bear Walter and his friend are learning by going on this adventure. Thank you so much to Barb for putting this on our radar. Again, it's called Into the Uncut Grass by Trevor Noah.
Well, I too read 2 picture books. I'm on that trend still. The first one is HANUKKAH PAJAMAKKAHS. So cute. The words are by Dara Henry and pictures by Olga and Aleksey Ivanov. It is about a young girl named Ruthie who receives pajamas on the first night of Hanukkah. And apparently on the last night of Hanukkah, the whole family dresses up in Hanukkah pajamas and they have this celebration. The parents say, save it for the celebration. She's like, no, I want to wear them now. So they're like, okay, as long as you don't get them dirty. Of course, we know how that goes with the kid, right? So over the next nights of Hanukkah, she's making traditional foods and going and visiting. And of course, her pajamas get lots of different stains on them and dribblings and everything. But in the end, the family has their wonderful HANUKKAH PAJAMAKKAHS party. Interesting book. I think it's just a good book for kids who celebrate Hanukkah to see themselves represented. Because I don't know if there's a moral of the story other than like maybe parents don't need to stress out about kids' pajamas getting dirty.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
It's just a fun book, and I enjoyed it. I like the illustrations, which are very colorful and vibrant.
I personally try to wear clothes that feel like pajamas every time I put clothes on, so I can understand her desire to wear her pajamas every day.
And then the other picture book I picked up is Momma's Going to March. This is by Jennifer Maruno and Vivian Rosas. It is a book about mom going on a march. It's based on some very important protest marches that have taken place in American society over the decades, but it's all about making signs and what the signs represent and why people march. It's very, I wouldn't say bold illustrations, and they're not, what would you call that, Emily? You know that they're people, but they're not like accurate presentations of people.
Right, like their arms are really broad and wide, and the color palette is kind of muted, but really beautiful colors.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And it has a lot of different traditions in it. In the author's note at the end, they list some of the marches that they are representing, and they were initially inspired by the Women's March in 2017 in Toronto. That made her think about the British suffragettes of 1903, and then she started looking at other significant protests. The 1963 March on Washington, the 1978 March for ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, 2003 anti-war protest, 2017 Great Lakes Water Walk, the 2019 global climate strike. So I thought this was a really great book to introduce to kids why people march and that marches can happen peacefully and what signs mean and what flags mean. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah,
so,
cool.
Again, that's Momma's Going to March.
Well, I read 2 more short stories in my year that's coming to an end of reading short stories. One of them was a surprise. I picked up Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata. Now, she's the author of Convenience Store Woman, which was one of our read-along books the year we read translated fiction. I thought this was a novel, so I picked it up sitting down thinking I was going to try her novel. It's got this great cover. It almost looks like it's just like a plate of udon noodles or something, and then you notice there's a heart, like a human heart sitting in the bowl and stuff. But underneath that, it says stories, which I had missed. So I was like, oh, instead, I'm going to read a short story for my short story project. And I decided to just turn to the first story and read it. It's called A First-Rate Material. It's about a young woman who's out with her 2 friends, and they're having a little meal together of tea and a little snack. And the main protagonist in the story is wearing a sweater made out of human hair. And her friends comment on how amazing it is, how beautiful. It was really expensive. She had to take out a loan to buy this sweater. And she said her fiance doesn't like things made out of humans. And they were like, well, what are you going to do? Because your wedding ring should be made out of human bone. I mean, the whole story starts to progress and you're like, this is really unusual. But then you realize we wear animals all the time. As I was reading it, I was wearing my alpaca wool sweater. I was wearing leather shoes, right? So she's really making you look at something in a very unusual way. And oh my God, did I love this story. Just really good. Really, really good. So I will be reading more from Sayaka Murata in this book, Life Ceremony. And Dwight Gardner, who's a reviewer for the New York Times, on the back, he says, chilly and transgressive at the same time. So cool, you could chill a bottle of wine in it.
I thought I was going to say a dead body in it.
Well, I mean, and then and someone else said Murata's skill is in turning around the world so that the abnormal, uncivil, or even savage paths appear, if momentarily to make sense. And I would say that's exactly what happened as I was reading that story. So again, the name of the collection is Life Ceremony, and then the story I read was A First-Rate Material. And then the other short story I read, Chris, I think this might be the first time I was on my e-reader and got drawn in by the ad that comes up, you know, when you first turn your e-reader on. But it was a short story by Jenny Colgan. And I've read her before. I've read Bookshop on the Corner and then another one called Meet Me at the Cupcake Cafe. She's someone I would turn to if I really wanted a lighthearted story. And she's very prolific. I think both of those books I just mentioned are in series. So she's written several series and standalones. And this was sold on my e-reader as a short story. But it did take me a while to read. And when I looked it up, once I was off my e-reader, it was 127 pages. So I'm not sure I would really call that a short story. I would probably call that a novella.
Interesting. So did you read it in like one sitting? Or
it took me 2 sittings to read it. It's a meet-cute short story. It's about a young woman who's asked by her ailing great aunt to find a book that she coveted as a child. And when her family moved, the book was either sold or misplaced, and she'd really like to see it again before she dies. And the book is Child's Garden of Verses by Robert Louis Stevenson, but it's illustrated by the artist Aubrey Beardsley. So as she sets out to try to find this by going to an antiquarian bookstore, she learns that the booksellers are like, oh, we're not sure that book ever existed. You know, no one's ever sure that those 2 famous people ever knew each other or that Beardsley ever really did do an illustrated copy of the book. You get the sense that the aunt is completely of sound mind and body. It's not like she's imagined this, and that it was very important in her childhood. The action moves on to this young woman going to Hay on Wye, the book town in Wales that I would love to go to. And she ends up meeting, and I'm saying that in air quotes, a young man who's an antiquarian bookseller, because the very first shop she had stopped in, which was near where she lived, and the guy said, "Oh, we're not sure that book ever existed, but why don't you go look for it more deeply?" Sent his nephew to follow her, because if indeed that book existed, it would be worth a lot of money, and he wanted to get his hands on it. So as the reader, you know that this is a meet cute, but it's also one of those setups where at some point the truth's going to come out and it'll be trouble. It was really lighthearted. It was really fun. I enjoyed it. The young man who's the nephew working for the bookshop, that wasn't really what he set off to want to do in his life. But there he is doing it. And at one point they're having tea and she asks him something about being a bookseller. There was this little inside joke about bookselling that I thought I would read, this funny little quote. So he says, "It was meant to be a stopgap to be working at this bookstore. But he said, here I am looking for a Dickens book. I'm basically an indentured servant, but with a good postcode." And then Mirren, who's the protagonist, said, "But there must be money in it somewhere." And he said, "Oh, you can make a small fortune in antiquarian bookselling, provided you started with a large one." And he said, sorry, a little inside bookselling humor there. I thought that was cute. So if you're somebody who likes antiquarian books and likes bookshops, this would be a fun little read for you. It was exactly what I was looking for at the time that I read it. Again, it's called The Christmas Book Hunt by Jenny Colgan. Jenny Colgan, on the bio in the back of the book, it says that she was entered into the 2015 Love Stories Hall of Fame. I have looked that up everywhere. I cannot find it.
Oh, interesting.
Maybe it's a British thing. I don't know. If anyone knows what the Love Stories Hall of Fame is, let me know. I wasn't sure if that meant one of her stories was entered, if she as the author was. A little fun fact that I couldn't verify.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. So 2 really great short stories these past 2 weeks.
Awesome. Well, coming up next, we are going to be talking about our 4th quarter read-along pick, A Little Bit Country by Brian D. Kennedy. We had a wonderful conversation last weekend with some listeners who joined us on Zoom to talk about the book.
Yeah, and it turns out we did query folks who had read all 4 of our read-alongs for this year, and A Little Bit Country rose to the top.
Yeah.
People really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. I mean, it was a really good escape book for me, just to dive into a romance. So it is a romance. This is our last book in our year of reading romance. So I knew it would be, quote, safe in that way. It's about 2 gay boys who are still in high school. Just a delightful story. I mean, there was some tension. You know, one of the boys isn't out. He's also facing financial hardship. And there's some other tension within the book, but nothing that overwhelmed the romance, in my opinion anyway.
Right. I mean, I think it's Emmett and Luke. Emmett is living in Illinois. He is in a family that's very accepting of who he is. And he is going to live with his aunt in Tennessee to go work at Wanda World, which is like a Dollywood amusement park. With lots of singing and dancing. Singing
and dancing, amusement rides, and restaurants and whatnot. It's named after Wanda Jean, who was the Dolly Parton character of this book, a very famous country music singer.
And the other character is Luke, who is in a family that's having a lot of struggles. His mother isn't well. He's working at a factory. He's unhappy in his job there, and he is not out. And he, unbeknownst to his family, quits his job at the factory and with the help of a friend who he had previously dated, gets a job working at Wanda World in a restaurant.
Yeah, because his dream is to be a chef.
Right.
He loves to cook. He has 2 younger siblings that he's always cooking for. His mom is not in great health. And his stepdad, he was working the night shift, so Luke was doing all the cooking and a lot of the cleaning and everything. And Luke's family are not fans of Wanda Jean because Luke's grandmother was an up-and-coming country singer. Verna is her name. Nana in the book as well. She was an up-and-coming country singer with Wanda Jean, and there was a big falling out because Verna took off with Wanda's husband.
And if you're thinking this sounds like a country music song...
yes, indeed. Luke takes this job working at a restaurant in Wanderworld, and he's not telling anyone. So there's that secret, the secret that he's gay. His parents are trying to hide their financial stresses from him, but he sees the bills piling up that are due. And he wants to be a cook, right? A chef. And so I thought it was lovely that he is in this kitchen and he's hired as a dishwasher.
Which is also the classic role that a lot of up-and-coming chefs... I worked with someone who owned 2 restaurants that started as a dishwasher back in the day.
Yeah. He's loving the job because a lot of the chefs in the kitchen, they're teaching him things and he's learning. So he's really enjoying the job, but it's stressful for him because he cannot let his mom find out because she'd be brokenhearted.
Right. He's keeping a big secret from his mom, who he has a good relationship with.
Yeah.
Which always adds a layer of tension.
Right. So then along comes Emmett from Oak Park, Illinois, all out. He wants to be the biggest gay country music star ever. And he's bound and determined to do that. He gets a gig working at Wanderworld for the summer, and as Emily said, is staying with his Aunt Karen, right? Mm-hmm. And of course, these two meet.
Right. It's a great setup in that way. You know, one of the things we've talked about romance is there always has to be a reason that people come together, just like what I was just talking about with that short story. The aunt is looking for her book, and the woman sets off and meets a man in the bookstore. Same thing here.
Yeah. And their meet cute is Luke is running a little bit late for his interview. He's in Wanderworld, and he bumps into Emmett, who is the second part of an ass costume, I think, a donkey ass kind of costume, and they bump into each other, and that's their meet cute.
Right. It's very cute. There's some really sweet laugh out loud moments. I felt like the dialogue was wonderful and very real. This is, we should say, a young adult book. So there wasn't a lot of sex or...
Like they did it, but you don't get any details whatsoever.
Closed doors.
Yeah.
Is that what it's called?
Yeah, right. Yeah. And there's that tension of what Luke is going through, and Emmett is trying to make it. So he has this gig performing, but then he's also doing an open mic with some of the other performers. He sings his own songs, and he's hoping to get scouted by a major label there. You know, from what we said earlier with Luke's grandmother being an upcoming country music singer who then her career is cut short and she's not really heard from anymore, but she was a great songwriter. And Wanda Jean is everywhere, of course. History never dies, right? Those histories all come back and have a bit of a collision together.
And it's really good. And there were some things that really surprised me in the novel. I enjoyed it so much. I'm so glad we chose this book.
I am too. In our conversation with listeners on Zoom the other day, we talked about how it did talk about some of the stresses of being in the closet, that you do feel like you're two different people living different lives, and then just the anxiety over being outed. And Luke does work with somebody initially at the factory job who is verbally homophobic towards him. But I feel like Brian Kennedy does a good job of having that risk of being out. Like there's a threat to being out. There always is, being afraid your family's going to disown you. But there's that threat in the society at large too, right? Yeah. But again, it doesn't overwhelm the story. And also, at least one person said that they appreciated how he talked in here about that you don't have to come out.
Right.
It's a personal choice. And that's just such an important message, I think, for younger people, because it's not safe for everybody to come out at whatever age you are.
Right.
But that hopefully you will be able to create a life where that is possible. And that's some of the tension in this book, is what choices will people make?
Exactly. And another listener said that they thought it was a real depiction of teenage romance. And I would agree with that too, that I thought Brian did a really good job with that.
Yeah, I really liked it. I mean, some of the quotes are lovely. I mean, there's Emmett who says that I'd rather dream too big and come up short than dream too small and regret it.
Yes.
Because this is a kid. He's swinging for the bleachers,
He
you know.
is,
He says, winning my first Grammy is more important than losing my virginity. for a teenage boy to say that he is on a mission.
I think he must be a Capricorn. I mean, I could ask Brian that when we talk to him. His work life is much more important than his romantic life.
But it's good. And there is a bit of an adult relationship, too. Aunt Karen has a boyfriend who works at Wander World.
Another thing a listener said is she would consider this to be a romance that's a happily for now, because they are teenagers. And lots of times we've talked about how romances are HEAs, happily ever after.
Yeah.
And I thought that was a good observation as well.
Yeah, it is. Because like one is in Nashville and the other one is up in suburbs of Chicago, and they're in high school still. So, that long distance thing.
And at the end of this episode, we're going to have a conversation with the author, Brian Kennedy. So we'll be talking more about A Little Bit Country. And I think we should just also say thank you to everyone who read along with us with romance this year. It was a really fun year of reading.
It really was. I enjoyed all of the books that we chose. I think we lucked out in our choices. And I know some people who have joined us with these books are not romance readers, and they gave it a shot. And other people said, no, not going there. And I respect that. And then we learned so much from our listeners who are romance readers. We got turned on to so many good books and authors.
Yeah.
We'll be recapping our own romance reading at the end of the year, beginning of next year, as we talk about our bingo cards.
Yes. But we just wanted to say thank you to everybody. The year's not over yet. I have more romances queued up. So, Chris, did you go on any biblio adventures?
Well, I was in Chicago last week for another family funeral, unfortunately. My cousin Roberta died unexpectedly. She was a big reader and a big supporter of the podcast. She always was amazed at everything that we're up to. She, however, did not like Willa Cather. So there are things you have to put up with family members sometimes. Although I did send her a copy of Death Comes for the Archbishop because I thought she might like that, but she didn't get to it, unfortunately. However, I did make it to my favorite used bookstore in the area there, the Frugal Muse. I had a good browse one day, and I picked up a copy of Studies in Classic American Literature by D.H. Lawrence. So Lawrence was a writer, and I've only read one book of his, I think Sons and Lovers. And I've heard about his criticism, that he wrote criticism about American literature, and I was happy to find this copy. It's actually from 1969. It's the 8th printing of this book. The first copyright was 1923. Amazingly, it's held up really well, and it doesn't smell, and the pages aren't fading. So I look forward to reading this, because he does have some essays here on Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Melville, and other writers. So I'm interested in what he has to say. The first essay is called The Spirit of Place. And he talks about how, at least at the time he was writing, so many people considered classic American novels children's literature. And he's like, there's nothing childish about it.
That's interesting.
I mean, you think about it, too. Like, we talked about that the year we did The Scarlet Letter, our Scarlet Summer, just talking about The Scarlet Letter. Why do we have young teenagers read something like that?
And so many of the classics. So that's a really good point.
Yeah. So I was really happy to come home with this.
Nice.
And then I also did see a Little Free Library. Actually, it was a school Little Free Library from St. Joseph Catholic School in Downers Grove. It was the first library I've seen that was designed, constructed, and installed by a class. It was a gift from the class of 2022. And what was really sweet about it was that inside, behind the books, all the students signed their name. And I just thought that was really lovely.
Yeah, what a fun project. And it'd be fun for them to go back, like their reunions, and reminisce about it. That's so cool. And was it filled with books?
It was. Mainly kids' books, because it's a grade school, I believe. I did take pictures, so I'll post some of those.
Great. Well, I had a Grammy and Nina great adventure. The day after Thanksgiving, I flew to Michigan, and the next day, I flew home with Nina. Because Rachel and Nina moved to Connecticut.
Yay.
Which is really
Oh my God.
exciting. And the drive was too far for little Nina. And Rachel has a million animals that she loves. So she drove here with a car filled with animals. And in Nina's first week in Connecticut, we hit the West Hartford Public Library, the Cromwell Public Library, and the Wallingford Public Library. So she's getting to see the towns via library. And it's really fun. And so many of her books got packed when the pods haven't arrived yet. So we wanted to load up on books to read to her. I have to say, I think I had 2 for the plane ride, and it brought back memories of how quickly you can tire of reading the same books over and over. And I just want to shout out libraries. We have a lot of listeners that are librarians. I sit across the table from a librarian. Y'all are amazing people. Just yesterday, I had a time crunch where I had to be in 2 places at the same time and had 10 minutes to figure out how to get on a Zoom call. And I raced into the Durham Public Library and said, is there any place I can take a call for an hour? And she was like, well, do you need to talk or do you need to just listen? And I was like, I kind of need to talk. And she set me up in the basement. I never even knew the Durham Library had a basement with a big conference room. Yeah. Just hats off to the importance of public libraries, libraries in general, and librarians who are quick draws on helping solve problems. And then we also had our great fourth quarter read-along discussion, as we just mentioned when we were talking about A Little Bit Country. And thank you to everyone who participated in that conversation. And just a reminder that our read-alongs are free. We do ask you to send an email to sign up just so we can hold your spot. And we're a safe space.
Yeah, it's a great group of people who always join us. We have wonderful conversations.
Yes.
Oh, speaking of conversations, I'd like to give a shout out to Sean Breed's books. That was a biblio-adventure I had with him, a recent video he just posted, having a conversation with him and James and Dorian, 2 other book friends. We conversed about bailing on books / DNFing / do you finish every book you start kind of conversation. These were inspired by 2 articles in The Atlantic. One that was pro bailing, the other that was con bailing. So we'll put a link in the show note to that. We know a lot of you watch Sean's videos over there on BookTube, but just wanted to give that a shout out.
Speaking of DNFing, I DNF'd a show.
Did you?
Yes, that I was really looking forward to. So any listeners out there, if you're watching it, tell me if I need to dig back in, because I have been slightly tired. It is Like Water for Chocolate.
Oh.
Based on the novel by Laura Esquivel.
Uh-huh.
And it's a new 6-part serialized version on, I believe, HBO. I mean, it looked beautiful. I just couldn't, I don't know. There was something about it that wasn't grabbing me.
That's so interesting, because just the other day, Laura stumbled across it. She's like, oh, wow, they have a whole series now? So that's interesting. I know she's planning on watching it.
Okay.
Yeah, listeners, let us know what you think if you've dipped into that one.
I loved the novel. I mean, I think I read the novel when it came out, which was back in the late 80s.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there was a movie made. I don't know.
Wasn't it with Johnny Depp or somebody?
That's Chocolat.
Oh, okay.
Which is easy to confuse with Like Water for Chocolate.
Okay.
Which I loved that movie and that book as well. Yeah, I wanted to really love this. And again, I don't know. It's subtitles, so I don't know if it was partly like I was tired and my eyes couldn't keep up or what. Mm-hmm. But if anyone's watching it and you think I should jump back in, let me know. And I'll definitely ask Laura.
All right. So what about upcoming jaunts?
Ooh, exciting one. This Saturday, December 14th, which sadly will have already happened once you all are listening to this episode, but we will talk about it later after going. Juliet Grames, the author of The Lost Boys of Santa Quinonia, and Luann Rice, who will be there talking about her new YA novel, If Anything Happens to Me, are going to be in conversation together at the Essex Library Saturday at 2:00.
That's going to be a fun event.
Yes, I cannot wait to hear the 2 of them talking together. You know, when we had Luann on earlier this year, it was for her adult novel. I think the YA novel is kind of a thriller. So I'm interested to hear her talk about that. Mm-hmm. And then just a reminder about our Patreon reading salon on December 22nd.
last
Sunday.
one of the year. Yeah.
We'll be talking about our favorite books of the year.
Yes, that's going to be a really interesting conversation. For those of you who might just be catching us now, we started these Patreon reading salons just this year as something new to try. And we're going to keep it going next year, too. It's been a lot of fun. And so it is for patrons at the $5 or above level. You're automatically invited to join those conversations.
And it's the fourth Sunday of every month at 7 p.m. Eastern Time.
Well, the other thing on my calendar is Laura's show is finally opening this Friday, Miss Margaret's Barton Cottage Christmas. I cannot wait to see it. They had a dress rehearsal the other night, and she asked me if I wanted to see photos or if I wanted to be surprised. And I said I'd like to be surprised.
Nice.
Because I'll be going to opening night, and then Emily and Rachel will be coming on Sunday.
Yeah.
So the show goes through December 21st. So there are shows December 20th and 21st. That's why we're mentioning it again in case anyone in the area is able to attend and would like to get tickets. We have a link in the show notes for that.
Cannot wait. It's been so fun to watch her building sets outside in the backyard, and I see her going off to rehearsal every day, so cannot wait. Chris, do you have any upcoming reads?
I do. I have a very exciting upcoming read. And we didn't say anything about this at the beginning of the show because I guess we're sneaky that way. But we are about to announce our theme for our 2025 read-alongs, as well as the first book. So the book that we'll read for the first quarter. And that is The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson.
Our theme for 2025 is
Ghost Stories.
Wow. That's why we've been using words like haunting throughout. We were dropping little hints.
Yeah, The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, ghosts. It came to us months and months ago, and it just clicked for us that we wanted to do ghosts.
Yes. There's so many ways we can go. We've got lists of books already. I know we're going to be reading ghost stories as read-alongs and also additionally in our own reading lives throughout the course of the year.
Yes, and ghost stories and ghosts in literature go way back. I mean, you can go as far back, I think, in literary history as you possibly can and find ghosts. What comes to mind right now is Hamlet, which is not exactly all that far back in literary history, although, it's back there. So ghosts are such an important part of literature in the Western tradition, and I'm sure in other traditions as well. So I'm looking forward to exploring contemporary novels and then digging into the literary history of ghosts, too.
We're kind of looking at first quarter as Shirley Jackson quarter. We have The Haunting of Hill House will be our official read-along. We also have Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, which is a biography by Ruth Franklin. This book actually started it all here at the Book Cougars.
It did. For those of you who haven't heard this story, Emily and I were going on a biblio adventure. This is the first year that we met. We drove from Guilford, Connecticut, all the way up to Manchester, Vermont, to see Ruth Franklin talk about her newly released biography of Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life. We talked about books the whole way.
4.5 hours.
One way. We talked about books there, obviously, and then we listened, of course, to Ruth speak. We talked about books the whole way home. And before we got home, Emily had turned to me and said,
we should do a podcast and talk about books.
Yes, because we're talking about books all the time. So here we are, however many years later.
223 episodes later. We have a copy of Shirley Jackson's A Rather Haunted Life by Ruth Franklin that we're going to give away to newsletter subscriber. We have 2 beautiful copies of The Haunting of Hill House. It's a Penguin horror edition that they put out that are beautiful, that the publisher sent us, that we're going to give away to Patreons.
They're hardcovers with black and orange and gray coloring. The page edges are all black and the color seeps into the page. So like you feel this darkness, which is perfect for Hill House.
Very cool. And a reminder that there's a serialized television series of The Haunting of Hill House.
And several movie adaptations.
So, The Quarter of Shirley Jackson, as we said. Chris and I are planning to take a biblio adventure up to Bennington. We have done that once before. We have a video of us there. We'll post a link to that in the show notes, but we intend to go back.
Yes, we're going to go back up there again. Now, Shirley Jackson lived there in 2 different homes in Bennington, Vermont, after she was married and they moved from New York to Vermont because her husband was teaching there in the area. And yeah, both houses, they're private homes, but we did do a video in front of one and just took photos of the other. Now, The Haunting of Hill House, I have to say, is one of my favorite novels, and it has one of my very favorite scenes in American literature. So I cannot wait to discuss this book with everyone.
And we will let you know on a future episode the date of the read-along and any other details. But we did want to get the announcement out there for those of you who want to get the book queued up. We are excited about our year of reading ghost stories. Do you have any other books on your list? I have one.
I'm going to be reading a short story called The Inn by Guy de Maupassant, the French writer. I checked this out of the library on the way here. The story recently crossed my path as I was researching ghost stories, and it sounds like a good story. And I like his short stories a lot. The Necklace and Other Tales. This is a Modern Library Classics edition that I checked out of the library. I've read The Necklace and some of his other stories. I love his writing so much. So I was happy to see The Inn pop up in my research.
Oh my gosh, this is going to be a fun year. Well, I'm still on romance, and this was a book that was recommended during our read-along discussion on Sunday of A Little Bit Country. What we did that night was we talked for an hour about A Little Bit Country, and then we did a half an hour just kind of chatting with people about their experience reading romance and any thoughts they had. And I was talking about how I really hadn't had a chance to read a sports romance and wanted to read one. And when we were at the newly opened Montgomery and Taggart, which is a romance bookstore here in Connecticut, she said that hockey romances were really hot this year. So I had started one, and some of the language just made me put it down pretty quickly. It was not for me. And Kim recommended this graphic novel called Check Please. And it's book 1, hockey. It says book 1, #hockey. And she said it's got baking and romance and hockey. And I was like, check please, sign me up please. And even the front cover has a piece of pie.
Well, yeah, the front cover, like the kid's skating, he's in his hockey uniform skating, holding a pie.
Right, exactly. So I'm really excited to start this. Thank you so much, Kim. I would have never had this on my radar. And I believe there's another one out. I think she said that. At our library, they had this one on the shelf, number 1, and I was so happy to find it.
Now, as a mashup, was the book that you read about the woman who had sex with the ghost, was that a romance? Or was that just like straight fiction?
That was a Tess Gerritsen. I don't think it was a romance. I think that one was a couple years ago. I think it was a mystery.
Okay.
I'd have to look it up. It's unfortunately the only Tess Gerritsen I've ever read, and I know people love her writing, and she wrote the Rizzoli and Ives series or Isles series. Yeah. No, the one I tried to read was a modern, recent, straight romance. You know, like it wasn't, there was no murder mystery or anything like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I did have that one romance about the haunted castle in Scotland.
Yes.
So I had a little mashup going on there with ghosts and romance.
It's been hard to keep this from you, y'all, because we made this decision when we were standing in the Barnes and Noble on Long Island in late June, early July. So for half of the year we've known, which is really funny. And then the other thing I have queued up in upcoming reads is I did receive my Advent calendar short story box, which I talked about in our holiday gift guide. It was a little bit surprising what it ended up being. It's literally a box with 25 little booklets, and each of the booklets is a short story. So I'm planning to end my year of short story reading with this, just starting at number 1, which is In the Stacks by Robin Sloan. And one of the things I'm really looking forward to is reading authors that I've never read before, and short stories are such a great way to do that.
Right. So are those little booklets numbered?
Yes.
Or, yeah. Okay.
I just pulled out
Oh, yeah.
number
Look at
one.
that. Oh, that's hard to look at.
Yeah. It's very busy, but beautiful colors.
Yeah.
And they're tiny. They're not very thick. And they all seem to be pretty thin. So
yeah, they're like little pamphlets. It's kind of
we're going to
nice.
show it on our Friday Reads video this week. So you'll get a show and tell. Or somewhere. We'll do show and tell somewhere.
Somewhere, yes. All right, everybody. Well, coming up next is our conversation with Brian D. Kennedy. Happy reading!
We're excited to welcome Brian D. Kennedy, author of A Little Bit Country, our fourth quarter read-along pick in our year of reading romance. Brian is originally from Minnesota and now lives in New York City with his husband and their miniature schnauzer, Stanley. His slightly unhealthy obsessions include seeing as many Broadway shows as possible and buying weird trinkets off eBay. Hopefully we'll get a chance to ask him about some of these weird trinkets. A Little Bit Country was Brian's debut novel and is part tribute to one of the loves of his life and someone we both adore, Dolly Parton. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
The first question we thought we'd ask is, how did you fall in love with Dolly Parton?
Yeah, that's a good question. I grew up in Minnesota, like my bio said, and we didn't listen to a lot of country music. I wasn't a fan of country. I think this was in the 90s, so 80s and 90s, but Garth Brooks was maybe the one name that everyone knew. And then for me, the only way I knew Dolly was her Christmas album with Kenny Rogers. We played that at my house, so that was sort of like my window to her. I just knew her as the Christmas lady, and she wasn't even known as an artist, at least in my circle at that time. So it wasn't really till later in my 20s, and actually after I came out, that I was sort of like, okay, well, I see the appeal. She's a very campy, fun character, and I was sort of drawn to that. But then I actually started listening to her music, and in the early aughts, she did 3 bluegrass albums within a couple of years. And once I listened to those, I was like, okay, she wrote these lyrics. She is a real artist. And I sort of did a deeper dive into all of her past albums. And she really sort of opened me up to the genre. And I'm a huge country fan now. I listen to, people other than Dolly. So yeah, she was sort of what got me hooked on the genre.
Oh, that's awesome. We were wondering too, what was your journey to becoming a writer? And then how did this idea develop?
It was a long journey. Ever since I was a kid, I always liked writing. I enjoyed writing. I took poetry classes in middle school and wanted to write plays in high school and college. But I never really thought as publishing as something that I could pursue professionally until I was maybe in my 30s. I had a day job that I, wasn't really passionate about. It didn't leave a lot of room for creativity for me to have that sort of outlet. So I decided to really focus on pursuing publication. And I think the reason I thought it was even possible was probably the internet, finding other writers on Twitter or reading blog posts about how other people did it. And I said, I think that's something I can, if not do, at least try to do. So let me give it a shot. So I did. And I signed up for a writing class again as an adult. And from that moment to when my book was officially published, I think it was probably 7 or 8 years in between. But I was having a great time regardless. I was meeting other writers. I was working on my craft. I was enjoying taking classes and workshops. And through that, I got an agent with a different manuscript that I had written. And we tried to sell that to editors. And we got close, and we got a lot of feedback from editors, which was great, of what they liked about my book and why they didn't think it would work. And after we realized it wasn't going to sell, my agent sat me down and was like, all right, well, let's look at everything everyone said and let's give them a reason not to say that the next time. So the main feedback on my first manuscript was that it was just too quiet and it wouldn't stand out in a crowded market. So she said, let's come up with an idea that, people aren't going to say this is too quiet. And I think when you write a book, you spend a lot of time working on it. So you sort of have to pick something you're, if not passionate about, at least interested in. And so for me, the obvious answer was country music and Dolly Parton. And I was obsessed with Dollywood. I'd never been to Dollywood, but I really wanted to go. And I said, that sounds like a fun world that I can create. Everyone if they don't at least love Dolly Parton, they know who she is. So it could stand out in that way. So I sort of pitched this idea of like two kids working at a country music theme park with a character that's basically Dolly Parton, but we won't call her Dolly. And my agent said, yeah, write that. Let's sell it. And then we did.
Wow. So did you sell it before you wrote it, or you had to write it?
Oh, no. Yeah.
Okay,
Sorry.
okay.
I wrote the entire thing first.
Okay.
Which, you know, I consider myself a slow writer. It probably took me over a year to write it. But then once it was ready, we put it out on submission with editors, and it actually sold. My first manuscript, you know, we tried to sell for a really long time and it didn't work out. And this one we sold very, very quickly, much more quickly than I was expecting. So I was very thankful for that.
Interesting.
That's very cool. So have you always written about gay characters mainly?
Yes and no. I think so. I actually probably wrote 2 manuscripts before A Little Bit Country. The first one I didn't, and that was probably around the same time Love, Simon was coming out, which that's the name of the movie, but the book was Simon and the Homo Sapien versus the Homo Sapien Agenda. So it was really around the time that we were starting to get, at least in the YA young adult space, more queer literature, and they were selling more. So I think when I sort of started before that, I didn't even realize there was much of a market for it. And I think a lot of queer writers had that sort of experience where they had to write straight characters because they thought that's what publishing would be more likely to buy. So my first manuscript definitely wasn't queer. I had like a queer side character. But then from that point on, once Becky's book came out and did really well, that sort of opened the door for a lot of other queer authors to be like, okay, people are reading it, which means publishing is going to buy it. So I'm going to write it. So yeah, ever since then, that's been my focus.
And did you always know you were going to write YA, Brian?
I didn't. I have kind of a funny story how that came about. You know, when I was in high school in the 90s, there wasn't really a lot of young adult literature. It was, my joke is always you go from like the Boxcar Children to Stephen King. There wasn't really much in between. So I wasn't familiar with YA at all. And when I first decided to pursue publishing in my 30s, when I was signing up for like classes in a workshop, I was in a workshop. It was a like nonfiction essay writing. And I submitted a piece about being in my early 20s and, you know, being out and how that made me feel. And the teacher of the class, this woman, she was very New York. She wore all black. She talked about how much she missed smoking. She wanted pieces that were like, she'd always talk about the pieces that need like blood in them, or like not literal blood, but like very heavy emotional topics. And then, you know, we read my piece in class and she's like, it's good, but it reads like a young adult book. And she didn't mean that as a compliment, but that actually drove me to pick up a young adult book at that age and sort of check it out. And as soon as I started reading them, I was like, yeah, I love this. This is what I want to do.
So
that's great. And it really shows because your characters are so real, you know, they feel like flesh and blood people.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. And one of the things that one of the listeners said in our read-along conversation over the weekend is that it felt like real teenage romance.
Oh.
You know, the language and the scenes really made it feel real, which was great.
That was actually a challenge for me too, because, you know, as a 30-year-old writing teens, you know, my experience of that, I'd been out of high school for such a long time that I didn't even know what a teen looked like anymore. You know, what a high schooler went through. You know, when I was in high school, we didn't have cell phones. We didn't have the internet to the extent that we have it now. We didn't have social media. So that was sort of, I think for a lot of writers, adults writing in the genre, that's always a barrier of they're like, how can I do this and make it real? And for me, the answer was just to read as much other YA books as I can and see how other authors are doing it, what they're talking about. And really any media that's geared towards teenagers, like TV shows, movies with teen characters, like you sort of just have to re-immerse yourself in what teens, how they act and what they care about now. And there, you know, there's universal themes like, you know, romance and confidence, like those are never going away. It's just sort of everything else that changes, like technology and stuff like that, that you have to sort of relearn.
Like viral videos, for example.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, viral videos. And then I appreciated how too, like the two main characters, they had different texting styles. And I don't know that I've ever really seen that depicted in a novel before. Usually it might be back and forth or somebody waiting for a text to come. But, you know, Emmett's really a heavy texter. Yeah, and Luke is not so much.
One of the things that also came up in our conversation was just wondering about when you were studying YA literature and seeing how other people were writing, are there rules about writing sex scenes for YA and what the publishers will allow?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There aren't any like hard and fast rules necessarily. I think a lot of it depends on the publisher or the editor or the writer even. In my book, there is sort of like a closed door sex scene where it's clear they're going to have sex. I just don't show it actually happening. I've never had any pushback on either of my books from my publisher being like, this language is too much or what they're doing is too much. I think as an author, as an adult writing teens, that's something I take very seriously. And sometimes it is kind of a hard balance of like finding the right tone, because I never want to like, with the scenes I write, I don't want to titillate readers, because that as an adult writing a teen, that just doesn't feel right to me. That's not what I'm interested in the book. But I also don't want to shame any teenager and thinking like, oh, you know, they didn't show sex, it's wrong. Like, that's not the message either. What I'm more interested in is the conversation the boys have about their first time and what they're feeling and what they're thinking, which I think is great to get out there, because you know, when I was a teen, like I said, we didn't even have much YA to begin with. And if there certainly weren't any scenes of two boys talking about sex and how it made them feel and being queer. So I think one of the great things about YA is it also opened that door to like put those conversations on the page and just normalize it for any queer teen who's feeling those types of things. I think they can use, at this point, hopefully they can find it in a book, a character who's sort of going through the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, one of the things we've done in our year of reading romance is to try and look at the history of the genre a little bit and just different trends and everything. And we were really excited to find your book because we wanted to read a debut. Well, I think our first book, we read Indigo by Beverly Jenkins, which was her debut as well. But we also wanted to read one by a man. And are you a romance reader? Is that what you go to? Or what's been your life experience with romance as a genre?
Yeah, it's surprisingly somewhat new to me. Another funny story was when I decided to write this, when I was still sort of coming up with the pitch and the story and the idea, I told my agent, I said, oh yeah, it's going to be a rom-com. Because to me, that just meant there'd be like funny parts and romantic parts. But I was not very well versed in the whole romance genre as it is and how robust it is. And now I know how magnificent it is and how these authors really run with the romance. So it was sort of a learning experience, because then when I turned in my first draft to my agent, she texted me like 20 pages into reading it and was like, hey, I'm loving this, but just a question, did you say this was a romance? I was like, I want it to be, but maybe it's not there yet. So I really did have to lean into that. And again, much like when I didn't know much, hadn't read many YA books, I had to start reading more romance books. And my editor was really great with working on me. I enjoy writing plot a lot more than like emotions and feelings. So a lot of times it's my editor being like, let's slow down a moment and like really work on their feelings and what they're thinking and what's going through their head. So she's been really great about pulling it out of me. And I think she probably had to do that a lot more with earlier drafts. But yeah, now I am really drawn to romance, and I've read a lot more since my book came out.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, we're all learning this year what kind of romances appeal to us, and it's an amazing genre. It's also so forward moving and forward thinking. So it's great that as we were reading this, a lot of us were thinking about how wonderful it would be for a young adult reader to come across your novel and have these characters available to them.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, that's the goal.
So let's talk a little bit about music, because there's a lot of music in this novel. One of our first questions about music is, did you have a soundtrack that you were playing as you were writing for inspiration?
Yes, I did. It will be no surprise to say there was a lot of Dolly. I think actually when I started to draft it, I went on iTunes and bought like a 4-disc compilation of hers that was like 4.5 hours of just Dolly music. And it was a lot of her earlier stuff that I hadn't heard or hadn't even been released on a CD prior to that, like on one of her studio albums. So I listened to that a lot. But yeah, I made a playlist. I usually make playlists for my books. So there was obviously a lot of Dolly, but I had other female country singers too. I really like Loretta Lynn a lot. Some more contemporary ones like Casey Musgrave and Miranda Lambert. And there are certain scenes that I would just write to like the same song over and over. It's almost like a Pavlovian response where like I hear that song and now I know like that's the scene I was working on when I wrote that.
That's so cool. Was it hard for you to do the song lyrics that you did write?
Yes, that was I was very nervous about that. I don't have any background in lyric writing, so all I could do was sort of study lyrics by other country artists and sort of emulate that, not necessarily steal, but sort of see how their tones were, like some of the older songs that were written by the character Verna Rose. I try to do more in the style of like Loretta Lynn, where it's more of like of a story being told. And then Emmett, who's obviously contemporaries, doing more contemporary songs, like maybe what Casey Musgraves would write. So I tried to sort of let that guide me a little bit, but then obviously with my own lyrics that I came up with.
Oh, that's great. I was wondering about that, if you had somebody in mind for Verna and in, country music history.
Yeah, definitely Loretta would be the inspiration for that one.
That's so fun. Well, I listened to the audiobook as well as reading the paper copy, and I was wondering when I got to those if they were going to sing the lyrics, and they didn't. They read it, so that was interesting. It'd be scary to sing someone else's lyrics as an audiobook narrator, I think. I'm
sure. And I think legally we'd probably have to pay them an extra fee for creating whatever they're singing it to. So.
That's true. Yeah, I didn't think about that. Of course, that totally makes sense.
Yeah.
I realized we didn't ask one of our other listener questions, was wondering, this is just a detail question. She was wondering how you chose Oak Park, Illinois as Emmett's hometown.
That's so funny. I think I was just searching for like middle-class suburbs. I think part of Oak Park leans more towards upper class. I'm not actually that sure. But I thought I randomly picked it just from like Googling and like looking at houses. And then after my book launched, I did an event here in New York, and then I went home to Minnesota to an event there as well. And afterwards we had a party with all my relatives that my parents put on, which was very nice of them. And I was talking to my uncle, and he's like, "Oh yeah, you picked Oak Park because your cousin lives there." I was like, oh, like I totally forgot that, but I think it must have been partly subconscious that I was like, oh yeah, like that sounds like a good name. Let me pick that one. So it must have been very deep in my brain.
Oh, that's great. It's a good choice. A lot of our listeners are in the Chicagoland area, so they have experience with Oak Park.
Yeah, and I think they hypothesize that it's also because it is more liberal, so that Emmett wouldn't be surprising that his character would be out and accepted more, and than Luke's character growing up in Tennessee.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad that worked out.
So now you have a new answer if you want.
Yes, exactly.
Well, it's also the birthplace of Ernest Hemingway, so there's that too.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, cool.
We would love to know about some of these trinkets you collect on eBay. What are some of the weirdest, if you're willing to share?
I mean, now I feel like I built that up too much. I don't know if any of them are super weird. Well, that's not true. Some are kind of weird. So I've definitely bought some Dolly related items, like a mug, but a vintage one that was like from Dollywood in probably the 90s that you can't buy there anymore. I bought a pin in the shape of the boot from Loretta Lynn's ranch, and also a big serving tray with a picture of Loretta on it that I actually have never used with company. And I feel like I feel bad about that. I need to take that back out. But my husband also like rolls his eyes at me anytime he sees something else coming in from eBay. But outside of country, I also really like gothic mysteries and books and sort of creepy vibes like that. And I've gotten into buying cabinet cards. I'm not even sure if I'm going to explain these correctly, but I think they're from the late 1800s, and I forget why they're called cabinet cards, maybe because they're displayed on people's cabinets. It's just like a photo taken at a professional studio of whoever, but just of people in like the Gilded Age posing. And there's a lot of them on eBay, and I buy them because I just think they're kind of cool. And they're not haunted, but like in my mind, I can sort of pretend maybe there's a story there.
And then do you put them up on the wall so your husband has to look at them eye to eye?
Not yet. I'm pretty good about hiding things away just so he can't be reminded of how much I bought.
Wow, that's great.
That.
I heard an interview with the actress Melissa McCarthy, and apparently she collects painted portraits of people that are complete strangers.
Oh, I love that.
You know, and
she
she does have a whole wall in her house, and her family thinks it's so creepy because it's like nobody knows who they are, but she loves them, you know? So
I did once. We were like upstate New York going through a thrift store, and there was this big portrait of this woman with like very 80s puffy hair holding her cat. I don't think it was even supposed to be on sale. I think it was the owner's, and she just had a bunch of junk there. And I was like, I am leaving this place with that. My husband was like, what are you doing? And I loved it so much that I couldn't even buy it. I had to make him buy it for me because I thought I was going to like start giggling just because it felt awkward or something. So I made him buy it for me. And it's in storage right now. We don't have it out, but I feel good knowing that I own it.
It seems like it should be a book cover eventually.
Yeah, there we go.
Maybe your third book. Speaking of which, can you tell us about your sophomore novel?
Yeah, so my second book is called My Fair Brady. It's sort of my take on My Fair Lady, about two boys who are putting on their spring musical, which of course is My Fair Lady. So it deals with a popular actor who doesn't get the lead role and is sort of dealt the blow because it goes to his ex-boyfriend. So he's feeling very down about that. And then a very shy kid who has no theater experience and decides to join the crew to try and make friends. And he's very shy and awkward. And they have sort of a run-in that's similar to Little Big Country, where it's literally running into each other. And from there, they sort of devise a plan where the popular kid is going to help make over the shy, awkward kid. And of course, being a rom-com, they end up falling in love by the end of the book.
Well, so you got your rom-com. That's great.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of hoping that you'll come out with a gothic-y teenage romance, you know, with some ghost action in the background, maybe.
Yeah, I definitely... Yeah, someday. I hope to too. Yeah, it's definitely in the works, something. I'm not sure what age category it will be yet, but yeah, that's the goal of mine.
Oh, awesome.
That's cool. Yeah, we just announced that our 2025 read-along theme is ghost stories.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, there's a lot of great ones, especially around this time of year. They release a bunch, so.
Yeah.
Do you have a favorite?
Oh, gosh. Now that I've been put on the spot. In the adult romance, I just read, it's called Do Your Worst by Rosie Dannon. And it's about a woman, I think it's in Scotland. Yeah, it's in Scotland, who has to go to a castle that a developer is trying to get rid of, but they think it's haunted. So she has to like give it the clear of artifacts. She searches for artifacts and they discover that it's haunted. Sort of a like grumpy enemies to lovers romance. It's very spicy, very much adult, not young adult, but I thoroughly enjoed it. Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Right on.
Check
We'll look
that
it up.
Yeah. Oh, one more question to put you on the spot. Do you have a favorite musical?
Oh, do I have a favorite musical? Yes. I love Stephen Sondheim. Like my top 5 are all Sondheim musicals, but my absolute favorite is Sunday in the Park with George, which is about George Seurat, the painter. And every time I see it, it makes me cry. And I've seen it at different stages in my life, too. And I feel like every time I get something new from it, just based on where I am as an artist in my career and where the character is. So, yeah, I just love it.
Yeah, very cool. Great. Do you get a lot of fan mail from teen readers, young adult readers?
Yeah, I would say, I don't know what a lot is necessarily, but yeah, I hear from teen readers. Sometimes I probably hear from people more just on social media, but occasionally I'll get a message in my Instagram inbox or through my website of a teen reader, especially for A Little Bit Country. I've gotten a lot of teen readers from southern areas in the U.S. just being like, saying, I felt so seen, which is like, as an author, like that's the best message you can ever get. I mean, they're thanking me, but just by getting that message, they've done so much to make me feel good about the book. So yeah, it's really great.
Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. It's a gift that you're giving them. It really is.
I'll say I get messages from adults. This was sort of my experience reading queer YA too, where they're like, if I had had this book as a teen, it would have meant so much to me. And that's part of the reason I love to write. I find it rewarding to write because these are the books I didn't have, and now I get to write them and hope that other teens can have them. So yeah, it's very, very rewarding.
Yeah. Gosh, well, thank you so much for this excellent novel, and I look forward to reading your second one as well, and whatever's coming after that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having him in your club and for having me on the podcast here.
Great to meet you, Brian. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Book Cougars with Chris Wallach and Emily Fine. We'll be back again with another episode in 2 weeks. Until then, come chat with us on social media, Goodreads, or email us at bookcougars@gmail.com. If you'd like to help support our podcast, please tell others about us, leave a review wherever you listen, and consider becoming a patron. Even $1 a month is a big help. Learn more about that on our website, bookcougars.com, where you'll find the show notes for this and all of our past episodes.
Thanks, everybody.
This episode was edited by Pat Keogh Sound Design.